The following story is also available as a read-only version. Check the link in the description if you're interested.
This story contains themes of graphic violence, sex, historic racism, and violence against minors. The first time I ever saw Heverec was in New Orleans, 1832. It was an unusually cool autumn night, and some poor sod from the street had been offered a fantastic sum to assassinate him. He would have been successful if all he had to do was slit Heverec's throat, like all the other people he'd gotten paid to dispose of over the years. Unfortunately, the usual method proved insufficient to take care of this one. Heverec was sitting outside a forgettably named alehouse, watching the traffic of the French Quarter pass him by, when the thug snuck up behind him and pulled the knife across his throat. He had already turned to run when Heverec grabbed him by the rear of his jacket and pulled him around. I still remember the expression of stoic anger Heverec had when he lifted his assassin by the neck and stared at him intently. Fear blazed in the thug's eyes as he saw the gash across Heverec's throat close as rapidly as it had appeared. Not a single drop of blood had been spilled. When Heverec released the man a moment later, he dropped to the ground with an identical cut across his own throat and bled out in minutes. He wasn't the first man sent to kill him, and he would not be the last. The last time I saw Heverec was in Ceylon, 1940. I was part of an expedition he had chartered to explore a recently discovered complex of ancient ruins kept miraculously intact through the ages. Deep within the labyrinthine complex there was an archway carved into the wall, as though someone had intended to add a room, but never quite gotten around to it. Heverec simply disappeared into the stone. He had a Halliburton briefcase in hand, the contents of which were unfamiliar to most of the expedition. I was among the few to know. I had to be. After all, I helped procure them. My name is Edgar Benedictus Grease. I was born in Oxfordshire on the 7th of August 1680. To escape my humble beginnings as the son of farmers, I enlisted as a privateer for the English crown during the War of the Spanish Succession. Eventually, I found myself sailing the Caribbean. I was never a pirate. All ship seizures carried out by me and my crew were done with a letter of marque, and I remained loyal to my country throughout the years. More by accident than purpose, I stumbled into a world of secrets hidden from the lives of ordinary people. Working with the Royal Navy, I secured employment as a liaison for intelligence operations relating to the occult. For king and country, I began trading in the things the Enlightenment would rather we had forgotten about. In 1730, I located the Fountain of Youth. It's not at all what you'd expect, and of the 7 people who bathed in it, I was the only one who survived. But immortality is a valuable gift, even among those denizens of this world who are not entirely human. The fact that all information regarding the place was destroyed so as to not tempt the king into something that might threaten the stability of the empire made it all the rarer. Succession, so the magistrates believed, was more important than eternal life. Heverec did not have problems with aging. The concept as such seemed peculiar to him, like some profane ritual performed by the Maroons of Haiti, or a pagan belief held by the Indian savages. I can only speculate as to his true nature, but I strongly suspect that, as average as Heverec appeared, he was altogether not of this world at all. Upon making my acquaintance in New Orleans, he immediately saw that I was not like most other people. We spoke over pulled pork, and he explained that he was in town looking for a baron, but he was proving very difficult to find. He wished to purchase weapons from the man, 5 in total, capable of killing while preserving the soul. I'd had dealings with Baron Criminel before, and he did not like me very much. I did, however, know a trustworthy Mambo who could summon him into the body of a Negro vagrant whose mind was racked from being a vessel for so many Loa over the years. My hope was that, by bringing the two in touch, my direct involvement in the transaction would not be necessary. It is rare for me to have problems in dealing with anyone who dislikes me with as much vehemence as Baron Criminel did, but he was powerful enough to make life difficult for me, and I wished to keep a respectful distance. The problem was that there was a certain barrier of communication between Heverec and the Baron. In spite of Heverec's flesh and blood presence, and Criminel seeing through the eyes of the vagrant, the lower could not see the man reaching out to him at all. There was only what he described as an absence, a hole in the world where Heverec should have been. The blindness was also a deafness, and so I had to be present during their negotiation to convey Heverec's words to Baron Criminel. Thankfully, the Baron was much too intrigued by Heverec to take much note of me. Baron Criminel took a small steamboat sitting on the Mississippi as payment for 5 small lockboxes. The boat took off into the bayou that very night, completely on its own, not a single member of the crew aboard, and was never seen or heard from again. Each of the boxes had a tiny silver key, and Heverec entrusted them all to me in exchange for a sum of money that would have bought 6 steamboats. He wanted me to keep them safe, and deliver them to him one by one when he called for them. I was already a wealthy man at the time, but the crown had become ever more parsimonious in rewarding my services. Sometimes they demanded I do things for which I would incur a net loss, trying to appeal to my patriotism for a land I hadn't seen in decades. The fact of the matter was that Heverec paid better than they ever had. To this day, I do not know where he got the money from, and I can't say that I much care to know. His dollars spent as well as the king's pounds. For 7 years I heard nothing from the man. I kept his keys secured in a secret vault underneath the main house of my small estate on Jamaica. I received his letter in 1839. He asked me to bring a single key, any one of them, to New Holland. It was one of the remote corners of the world I had never seen, and after a few years of sedentary living, I was itching for an adventure. My journey to Sydney took almost 2 months. I had sailed the Atlantic many times before, crisscrossing its cold waters from the Americas to Europe and Africa for reasons as numerous as there are stars on the firmament. It was a pond compared to the Pacific. When I learned that primitive peoples traveled these waters not in big steamers but boats that made even the sailing ships I once crewed look large by comparison, I gained great respect for the handful of Polynesian crewmen on the lower decks. After my arrival, it took another 2 weeks of grueling overland travel through New Holland's untamed wilderness to find myself in the heartland of New South Wales. The area was called Yathong, and its red soil nursed white flowers and reedy trees. Small lizards with skin like pine cones and hedgehogs with beaks resided there, as well as the outback's most iconic inhabitant, the kangaroo. Heverec was not travelling with civilized folk, but instead had opted for an escort of almost naked aboriginals, who covered their dark skin in pale mud. Had it not been for the artistic character of their paint, I would have assumed they were trying to pass as Europeans. I apologized for my delay, but Heverec assured me that time had a different meaning here. Every moment had been 1,000 years of experience, with every 1,000 years compressed into a single moment. He showed me trees where the bark had been skinned away and artfully carved, though it appeared that not everyone paid their respects to the trees after taking the bark. Where I'd travelled by road, map, and compass before, I was now fully dependent on Heverec's aboriginal guides. The experience was strange. Never before had I been able to orient myself so poorly. Sometimes it seemed that hours had passed while walking through a single grove, whereas other times long stretches seemed to take only minutes. I even lost track of the days. Once I looked up at the stars, only to recognize none of them, finding that my surroundings were still bright as day. Heverec seemed excited by this, conversing with the savages in their own brutish tongue. He only asked me for the key when what he referred to as the hunt began. The opened lockbox contained a simple stone knife, not unlike that of the aboriginals in the hunting party. It morphed into a spear in Heverec's hand, and he consulted with his entourage as to what this might mean. To this day I do not know how I was able to glean the meaning of that conversation, as I did not speak a word of their language. Only minutes later, Heverec hurled the spear at an emu, but missed. It occurred to me that I had never seen him miss any kind of attack. The emu escaped, and the other hunters did not even attempt to throw their own weapons after it. Instead, they chatted like commoners who had just seen the king pass them by on the street. Sometime later, it might have been hours or minutes, Heverec's spear transformed into what I learned was called a boomerang, another hunting implement of the Aboriginals. Soon after, we encountered a lone kangaroo, its rust-red fur glowing in the light of the evening sun. Once again, the hunters chatted, and once again, Heverec attacked. Once again, he missed. The kangaroo looked at him almost mockingly after the boomerang had sailed past it, then jumped away, turning into a small bird in mid-air. The boomerang morphed into a kind of trap, remaining that way for a while, only to transform into a simple wooden club when whoever Heverec was hunting changed his shape again. It became clear that the Aboriginals were beginning to lose faith in him. Fear was colouring their dark voices. It was only much later, I would guess several days, that Heverec suddenly lurched forward, club in hand, and smashed it into a small bushel of grass. Instead of a dull thud, I heard the tearing of flesh. There had been a small grey-brown snake in the grass, and Heverec had smashed its head. The club turned into a small glass vial in his hand, a little star trapped inside it. The soul of the shapeshifter he'd been hunting. Heverec deposited the vial in the little box, locked it, and handed the key back to me. I was to keep it separate from the others, as it had been spent, but still take great care to keep it hidden. With that, he led me to a nearby English town and bid me adieu. The third time I met Heverec was in 1845, when he asked me to bring a key not to some remote corner of the world, but instead to the cradle of civilization, Greece. He was waiting for me in a small fishing village on the shore of the Gulf of Actium. He told me he liked to listen to the songs of the green-blue water, but the real music he was after was being sung in the forest. Gnarled pines and verdant firs swayed gently in the wind, their leaves the only song I could hear. Heverec explained that, to find whom we were after, we would first have to visit the local pub and make the innkeep happy. It surprised me that Heverec was not very good at holding his wine. The drink was strong and vinegary, poured from old amphorae, and after only 2 cups Heverec had difficulty sitting upright. He encouraged me to drink more and drink it fast. We were not here to enjoy ourselves. When I was barely able to walk in a straight line anymore, Heverec took the lead into the forest. The rays of the full moon cut through the light foliage, and the dancing shadows that would have been threatening any other night assumed the shape of scantily clad Mediterranean maidens in my mind. After a while, I heard the singing. It was deep, guttural, accompanied by flutes, and very much happy. The cacophony grew from a feeling in my gut to something I could locate. In a small clearing, hairy men with the legs of goats danced in the moonlight. Tree stumps shaped like tables overflowed with fruit, bread, and casks of wine. Small mushrooms and buds of hemp lay on golden platters. Young men and women were among the revelers, athletic and nubile, displaying their bodies to each other and the satyrs. Their eyes were drunk on lust and inner spirit. In the trees, one of the satyrs had a particularly curvaceous beauty bent over the branch of an olive tree, her screams of pleasure joining the music as though they belonged. Nearby, another satyr had his finger up a man's rear, grinning as the fellow's eyes rolled back. My clothes felt heavy, constricting. The music drew me to them. I did not want to be me any longer, but joined them in their excess. Thoughts decidedly unchristian emerged in my mind. Desires which I'd never thought I'd feel welled up in my groin. Heverec interrupted their entrancement by asking for the key. It was like removing a telescope from your eye. The world came back into focus. I was still drunk, but I was me again. Though I felt the pull of the satyr song, I knew I could resist. The lockbox contained a dark bottle of wine, much larger than should have fit. I did not question it. Standing amid a crowd, entertaining them with some entrancing tale, was a particularly tall and fat satyr. A crown of leaves sat on his bald head, and moss grew in his thick grey beard. Upon spotting Heverec, he interrupted his storytelling, inspecting him with keen interest. Heverec introduced himself and said that he had brought a gift, holding up the bottle of wine. When the satyr was about to return the favour, Heverec told him that there was no need. The great Silenus was known far beyond these Hellenic isles. The mood dulled a bit. Whatever Silenus was seeing in Heverec, it was making him suspicious. He demanded the bottle be tested, first by Heverec, then by me, referred to merely as lackey. Heverec was happy to indulge him. He uncorked the bottle, took several deep swallows, and handed it off to me. It was still full to the brim, which confused me. Had Heverec only pretended to drink from it? I was too drunk to care. The wine was delicious, some of the best I'd ever had, especially after the piss water they'd served in the village. When I put down the bottle, it was still full. This seemed to assuage Silenus's fears. He put the bottle to his own lips and started drinking, then continued drinking, and still kept on going. He drank and did not stop until the entire celebration had congregated around us, fixated on the spectacle of the satyr trying to empty the endless wine bottle. Then he keeled over and died. Just like in New Holland, the bottle turned into a vial containing a single star. Nobody tried to interfere when Heverec went to pick it up. The music stopped, and the satyrs retreated into the shadows of the trees, melding with them until they disappeared entirely, leaving behind only their young, naked guests, who seemed ashamed and confused. Later, Heverec explained that the wine had been laced with a very weak poison. Neither of us could have ingested enough of it to die, but my hangover would be severe. He was speaking the truth. It took Heverec 20 years to contact me again. In 1865, I was fighting in the last battles of the American Civil War. I had received offers from my contacts in both the Union and the Confederacy to join their cause in exchange for ample compensation. I had always liked the South more than the North, but I could not support their ideals of slavery. Even subhumans were humans, I had come to believe. In my own holdings at least, the wage seemed to be a better motivator than the whip. I was about to be formally discharged when Heverec's communiqué reached me. He wanted me to bring another of the keys deep into the rainforest of the Congo. Civilized rule had recently returned to the region in the form of Portugal, and I was glad to have European rule of law instead of pygmy tribal arbitration in charge of the infrastructure. At first I believed that this was the reason Heverec had me recruit a group of pioneers, but thinking back to how at ease he had been with the aboriginals of New Holland, I could only assume that he did not wish to bring roads and proper buildings to the dark jungles of Africa. With my new army contacts, I was able to assemble a troop of 12 hardened survivalists, some of whom had already experienced life in the rainforest. We rode far up the Congo River on a pristine steamer operated by one Captain de Beja and his merry crew of Negro engineers. They spent much of their shifts singing songs and did an exceptional job at keeping the boat running as their captain navigated the perils of the Congo's slow but treacherous waters. We made landfall when we spotted a lone figure waiting for us at the shore by the joining of a tributary. How Heverec had navigated the dense bushlands and survived this long eluded me, and he offered no explanation. It did gain him the respect of the pioneers, however, and so we went into the forest, bewailing of spiders, scorpions, and snakes. It remains a mystery to me what made the particular clearing Heverec stopped us at different. To me, it seemed just like the dozen or so clearings we had passed over the course of the last week of overland travel, aside from maybe the pesky colony of monkeys that took to peltering us with rocks covered in their feces. A few shots of the musket into the treetops tended to drive them away, but they were a nuisance nonetheless. Heverec instructed us to fell trees and fashion them into stilts, then drive them into the ground like we were building a stairwell without the actual steps. It took us 3 days to erect the structure as specified, followed by another 3 days of waiting for Heverec to explain why he had done so. The answer came in not so many words, but in the witnessing of a fascinating event. One afternoon, the rain started pouring unexpectedly, yet the sun was still out. A rainbow formed in the downpour, and instead of staying in the sky, it descended to rest on the stilts we had built, forming the steps of a stairway that seemed to go right into the clouds. Heverec asked me to hand over the key and accompany him while the pioneers would cover our rear from the monkeys who would, according to Heverec, attack imminently. As we ascended the steps, he produced a thick canvas blanket from the box. Whatever was up there, somehow it would die because of this piece of fabric. There was an opening in one of the clouds, leading into a cave of smooth white stone. A man stood in it, presumably having come from deeper in the cloud cave to investigate the goings-on outside. His eyes were made of fire, his skin was black as obsidian, and he wore a coat made of shimmering feathers. Heverec approached him without hesitation, holding the blanket off to one side. After a moment of visible confusion, the man breathed flame onto Heverec, setting him ablaze in an instant. This seemed to faze him very little as he continued his approach, grabbing the dark man's arm. The flames disappeared first, setting his feather coat alight. Then, the receding burn scars on Heverec's skin made the attacker's face brittle until it began to melt and burn. With a swift movement, Heverec pulled the canvas over the Skyman, as if trying to put him out. For a moment, what was under the blanket remained solid. Then it simply collapsed, as if the man had disappeared and morphed into a vial containing a star. Outside, the day seemed to have turned into night. The pioneers were chasing away the last of the fleeing monkeys, many dozens of whom lay dead from gunshots or saber gashes. 3 of the pioneers had also died, their faces mutilated by the monkeys' claws and teeth. Another 2 were severely injured. One of them died on the way back to the river, the other lost a leg. Heverec compensated everyone for their services. There was not a scratch on him. Even more time passed before Heverec contacted me again. In 1896, he asked me to bring another of the keys to Alaska in the early days of spring. Having since sold my estate on Jamaica and various other Caribbean islands, save for a country house on Cuba, to move to sunny San Francisco, I was surprised at the proximity of this deployment. Instead of a cadre of seasoned soldiers, he asked me to bring the sickliest Indian orphan child I could find, preferably one that was young and would surely die within the year of some wasting disease or other, but one that could still walk. I found a young Athabascan girl that matched his criteria in Seattle and traveled with her to the icy shores of the Yakutat Bay. The child spoke very little, and I suspect she had a very shallow grasp of the English language. I could not denounce her for it. As an Englishman, I found the American flat and atonal bastardization of His Majesty's English unpleasant to hear and speak. Being a child of the proud river Indians on the Pacific shore, I could only imagine the disdain with which she would think of the Americans. Heverec had taken up residence in the attic of a trading post, and was regaling the locals with some tale of woe when we arrived. He had not changed the slightest bit. Even I had taken a trip to the Fountain of Youth in the meantime, but it seemed he simply did not age in the first place. His quarters were not specially heated, only the warmth coming up from below made staying in them bearable under several layers. Heverec did not seem to mind the cold. The dark mountains and blue glaciers on the fringes of the bay were majestic to behold. Though much melt had occurred in the ever-lengthening days, and travel by ship and canoe had become viable, much of the water, especially in the cluster of islands near the trading post, was still frozen enough to be somewhat safely walked on. For almost a week, Heverec took me and the girl out on the ice every day, walking from one island to the next, looking for something. I was half afraid the child would die before he found what he was looking for. On one particularly pleasant day, he told us to stop moving and listened intently. His expression became ever more excited, and after some time I heard it too. It was a humming, like that of an elderly woman, but deeper, more penetrating, coming from beneath the ice. It was a comforting and terrifying sound at the same time. The impulse to take the child away and back to the trading post grew in me, but she seemed particularly curious and began walking off in the direction of a small crevice in the ice she should not have been able to see from this distance. Heverec asked me for the key and pulled a single stick of dynamite and a leather ribbon from the lockbox. It occurred to me that dynamite had not yet been invented when Baron Criminel had sold the boxes to him, but was too distracted by the horror I felt when Heverec strapped the dynamite to the child's arm and lit the fuse with a matchstick. She seemed so enticed by the humming that she did not even take much note of the explosive now fastened to her body. As she approached the crevice, a head emerged from the water. At first, I believed it was a deformed seal, but its eyes were a void that seemed to suck away the light around them, and the smile on its lips was equal parts kindness and murderous intent. The child seemed unfazed by the creature's monstrous appearance. A webbed hand with bony black fingers grabbed the child, large enough to hold it completely, and was pulling it under the water when the dynamite exploded. The ice crackled underneath my feet, and the bang resonated from the mountains. Streaks of freezing blood and pieces of flesh surrounded the crevice, which had turned into a hole with jagged edges. I watched in despair as Heverec grabbed the little vial bobbing up and down in the water. He inspected the star inside it with a smile on his lips. After the events in Alaska, I spent several years questioning whether I would answer the call if Heverec summoned me for his final key. I had resolved not to, but after losing my estate and most of my fortune in the earthquake of 1906, I found myself in a position where I needed the money Heverec offered. Thus, in 1912, when I received a telegram asking me to come to Haiti, I took the final unused key and was on my way. To my surprise, Heverec asked me to arrange a parley with Baron Criminel ahead of finding whomever he wished to kill. It would, after all, be the final use of the weapons the Loa had given him, and maybe there was some unspoken agreement the nature of which eluded me. I had no contacts in Port-au-Prince, but finding a Hungan willing to have someone possessed did not prove to be as difficult as I had feared. Once again, it was a vagrant fellow, and once again, the Baron was unable to see or hear Heverec at all. They're very much the same person. The Baron Criminel was different in Haiti than he was in New Orleans. His voice was much darker, and his accent thickly African, often slipping into the island's French patois. He spoke in a slower, less belligerent manner, but also sounded more dangerous somehow. In New Orleans, he would have been willing to be joked about. In Haiti, Baron Criminel demanded much more formal respect. After the Baron declared that he remembered their last meeting well, Heverec asked me to hand over the key. He opened the final box and produced a small blade, its hilt ornamented with Asiatic calligraphy and symbols. Even though he could not see Heverec, Baron Criminel smiled at this. He said that he knew Heverec was going to try and kill him, so he gave him a knife with which a person could only kill themselves. Since the contract stated that the weapons had to be used, he would have no choice but to commit suicide. I was shocked. Baron Criminel had outmaneuvered Heverec. It was common enough with most people who entered into contracts with beings such as him, but for one reason or another I had not even considered the possibility of Heverec being trapped in the same manner. Looking at him, he did not look like a man who had been outplayed, but rather someone about to win the game and take the pot. "You did this to me," he said. "I remember those words like they were spoken to me right this moment. They are burned into my mind like the death of a friend or the parting of a lover." Heverec plunged the knife into his gut and pulled upward. As he keeled over, he reached out to touch Baron Criminel's shoulder. It was at this moment that the gash on Heverec's belly closed, and the vagrant vessel's cheap tunic became stained with blood. The smell of booze, guts, and excrement filled the room, and Baron Criminel's face was distorted in agony. When Heverec removed the knife from his gut, it was clean. As the Baron deflated with a pathetic whine, the weapon turned into a small vial containing a single star. Now that he had his 5 souls, Heverec informed me that he would need some time to locate what he called his point of exit. The next time he called me, time would be of the essence. Specific instructions would be delivered to me, and I would have to help him put together an expedition. As the years passed, I was often able to imagine that my acquaintance with Heverec had been little more than a dream. But every time I opened the safe in my study which contained his 5 keys, I was reminded that he would come calling one last time one day, and I would have to be ready. When Europe erupted into the Great War, I did not heed the call of either England nor America. Instead, I moved to Texas, where I purchased a lucrative ranch, but eventually chose to return to the sea by relocating to San Diego after a few years. I began to wander, taught at a university, visited London for several months, learned to fly an airplane, and learned the philosophies of Karl Marx and Martin Heidegger. When the Second Great War came, I almost did return into the service of the Crown, and I certainly would have gone overseas when America joined, but Heverec was faster. Attached to his summons was a blueprint for a briefcase which I was to see constructed by the Halliburton Company. It contained 5 depressions meant for 5 vials Heverec had stored in the lockboxes. It was difficult to find personnel for an expedition to a nameless ruin in the jungle of Ceylon. Everyone was either serving or waiting for America to join the war, but I had maintained and expanded upon my network of bold adventurers, and Heverec was able to pay as generously as always. In Colombo, we were met by Heverec and 2 local guides he had recruited. There was a tension in him, almost a kind of anxiety that looked utterly out of place on the man. In what seemed almost like a secret ceremony, he took the 5 keys from me and moved the soul vials from the lockboxes into the briefcase. After 6 days of travel by rail and elephant, we arrived at what seemed like little more than a hole in the ground by the side of a gargantuan boulder. It was actually the entrance to a vast network of caves. Though Heverec kept pushing, it took well over 2 days of ducking and squeezing to find our way to a simple room that was without a doubt unnatural in origin. The walls were perfectly smooth, save for the giant runes carved into them at regular intervals. I had never seen anything resembling these symbols before, and I have forgotten them since. Even at the time, they seemed to change whenever I looked at them anew. Simple arches were embossed from the walls at the far ends of the room, but only the one we had entered through actually led anywhere. The other simply encompassed a solid wall of stone. The only sound was a deep, rhythmic thrumming coming from the walls, until I noticed that, wherever Heverec was standing, faint whispers in a foul, alien tongue emanated from him. He thanked each of us individually, shaking my hand last. There was a sincere gratitude in his eyes when he did so. He even went so far as to call me a good and loyal friend. What happened next haunts my nightmares to this day. Without hesitation, Heverec grabbed his tongue with both hands and began pulling vehemently, screaming in pain as he did so. All the other members of the expedition were petrified, unsure what to do, and I had seen enough of the world to simply let things take their course. After maybe a full minute of pulling and tormented gargling, there was a ripping sound, then another, followed by a third one that sounded particularly wet. Heverec's tongue was bleeding black ooze. He carefully laid it into a small bowl set into the ground in the center of the room, where it liquefied in seconds and was drained through an invisible mechanism. Heverec grabbed the briefcase, nodded to me one last time, and walked through the archway to nowhere. The stone swallowed him up, as though it wasn't even there.
If you liked this story and would like to hear more, please do subscribe to the YouTube channel. A new short story is uploaded every Wednesday, and there will occasionally be another one in between if I find the time. Thank you very much for listening and have a great day.